welcome to the Art of Being Human. Now, I've been working with various types of intelligence and testing of intelligence, and right now I'm working with retardation. And I know the word is not popular, it's become a very unpopular word, but it is a medical term meant to describe people who have difficulty with their cognitive functioning. And if I had to use that phrase, difficulty with cognitive functioning all the time, then that's what you'd hear most of the day, and I don't want to do that. So retardation describes it. It has no meaning in terms of the value of the human being, the worth of the human being, how good they are, what kind of people they are. Has nothing to do with that. It is just a medical term to describe the situation of the intellect being not quite normal. So I want to start off by showing you this chart that I have here. And I'd given you a list of the different types of intelligence and what the score numbers are. But here what I want to do is show you what the IQ is and what people are capable of doing with that IQ. And that may be a more reasonable way of looking at it. What can a person do? How can they function? How well can they function? What are the kinds of things that are normal for them to do? What are things that are too much for them to do? So let's just get started with this chart. Okay, if you have a level that's considered mild retardation, then the IQ is going to be from 50 to 70. Remember, in the way that I've been doing this, 100 is perfectly normal, but 100 from, let's say, 90 to 110, it would be the entire range. It would be like 10 score points in either direction, but 100 is perfectly normal. So you will have 50 to 70. Below 70 is retardation, for sure. 85% of the people who are retarded are in this range. So this is a very common range for people, if they're going to be retarded, to be in. What can they do? Well, they can learn to about a 6th grade level. And that's pretty good. I mean, they'd be able to take care of themselves, they'd be able to bathe themselves, they'd be able to cook some simple meals maybe. You know, they can function. There's no reason why they can't. So they learn to the 6th grade level, and they do have social and vocational skills that they can call upon. So therefore, they can function in society without a whole lot of supervision. Now, moderate IQ is going to be from 35 to 49. That would be the score. Moderate, 35 to 49. And only about 10% have this kind of retardation. They can learn to do 2nd grade level work. They would need to be supervised to do simple tasks because they can't progress beyond the 2nd grade. If you want to put some kind of a score on this. Now, what can a 2nd grader do? Well, they can read simple things, you know, the old Dick and Jane books and things like that. They can read simple things, and they can do a little bit of math. They can add 3 and 2 and get 5 or something like that, but it's very, very limited. So they have to have a lot of supervision in simple tasks because they really can't handle that very well. Severe retardation is 20 to 34, and only 3 or 4% of people with retardation are at that level. They sometimes can learn to talk a little bit. They might be able to do some very, very simple work with supervision, but they really can't do much. And only about 3 to 4% of the population is at that level. And then you have profound retardation would be below 20. Very hard to test it because they can't respond. They can't respond to questions that you ask, but you can look at their behavior and you can see that they're very low. Only 1 to 2% of people are in this level, and they need constant adult supervision. They're like babies. They never mature. And so that's what they are. They may look like they've grown up. They may be like 5 feet tall, but you can tell by their face and their facial expressions that they're just basically not functioning very well. So those are the levels. We had, when I was growing up, a family that lived across the street, and they were all brilliant, except for this one boy who was very severely retarded. I would say he was probably 20 or less. I mean, he was profoundly retarded. He could walk, and he could make noises. Once in a while, he could say a word. That was it. And what he used to do, my father was a musician, a very good musician, and he used to spend hours practicing, and this boy loved music. He would respond to music. So he would kind of walk across the street. We were directly across from them, and he would somehow manage to get through our outside steps and onto our porch and stand on the porch and stare through the window watching my father practice. And he might rock back and forth a little bit or make some noises, but as long as my father was producing music, and he practiced for hours a day, he played brass instruments, he would just stand there and stare and stare and stare. He absolutely loved it. And someone would come over and get him and take him back home. If they took him out to play ball, his idea of playing ball, and I found this very fascinating even as a child, because he was quite a bit older than my sister and I were. We were the oldest in our family, and we were still children, but I do remember this very well. They would throw him a ball for him to bat. And of course, he couldn't bat it. He would stand there and he'd hold his bat. The ball would roll past him quite a distance, and suddenly he realized there was a ball that had come and he'd missed it. Then he would turn around and try to get the ball, but he couldn't respond fast enough to know that there was a ball that was coming his way. He waited until it got well past him before his brain registered the fact that he'd missed a ball. And that's the way he played ball. He just stood there and held it, and when the ball went past by a few seconds, he realized he'd missed it. Then he would try to turn around and get it. That was it. That's the most complicated play that he could manage. And they would be out there with him. He came from a wonderful family, and they were all brilliant. They were doctors and nurses and dental technicians, all professional people. And the father owned a business, a grocery store in town, and they were terrific people, but they had this one child that just was miserable in terms of the fact that his IQ was so low. They took wonderful care of him. They wouldn't let him go into an institution because they were afraid that the institution would not give him the care that he needed, so they all took care of him at home, and they took their turns, and he was never alone, and he was always very well cared for. Now, it used to be said that Mongoloid children, I'm not sure he fit into that classification, but the Mongoloid children didn't live very long. Mongolism is when it's a type of retardation in which there's an extra chromosome, so the body doesn't function right because it doesn't have the right number of chromosomes. And they used to say they didn't live very long, but that was partly because they were sent to institutions because families somehow couldn't manage them, and they didn't get the best care. I think now a person who's a Mongoloid child can live a fairly good life, a fairly long life, because if they're getting the medical care they need, and a lot of these people who are retarded, they have extra medical issues. They're not just healthy, they're not just retarded, but they're retarded with health problems in addition to that. So that's not unusual to find a child that has got medical issues as well as the retardation, and those medical issues need attention as well. And if they don't get it, then their lives probably are shortened somewhat. But with all the attention that they need, if they receive it, they can live a pretty good long life. Okay, so we're finished with this chart. I want to talk about mild retardation and go into that for a minute. Mild retardation has no specific cause, and it tends to run in families. And nobody knows why, nobody knows what causes it, but if you have a child that's mildly retarded, and so we're talking about 70 IQ or 50 to 70 IQ, for some reason they're that way, and it does seem to run in families, and so therefore there may be a genetic issue, but no one can show exactly what it is. If you have very severe retardation, then it's usually something went wrong in the birth process, or something went wrong as the person was developing in the womb. There was an accident somewhere, something went wrong, but it's not so much related to family issues. It would be something at birth that worked, that didn't work right, or somewhere in the developmental process something went wrong, but not related to a family issue. Mild retardation will run in families, but severe retardation is probably an accident or something going wrong in the process of the development, but not necessarily related to family issues. So that's something important to remember. For mild retardations, these are the symptoms. They're slow to carry out tasks. Math and reading is very difficult for them. And they also have hyperactivity, repetitive motions, and autism. For some reason, autism runs higher in this group of people than it does in a normal population. There are 4 times more autism in a group of mildly retarded people than there are in the general population. Why that is, I don't know. Now, you have to remember that symptoms can mimic each other, and sometimes it's difficult to tell when a child is reacting in a certain way that doesn't seem normal. Is it because he's autistic? Is it because maybe he has some kind of an attention deficit disorder like ADD? Or is there something else going on? It's hard to tell. Now, I'm going to tell you about a family where a child was schizophrenic. And this is a documented case where a child had some kind of a problem. He was schizophrenic. She was schizophrenic, was a female child. And they had all of the symptoms of the schizophrenia. The visual hallucinations, the hallucinations where they hear things that are not there, see things that are not there, all of that kind of thing this child had. And so when she was quiet, they were worried because they felt that she was hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there. They had to watch her because she would attack family members. She was being told to do things. And even though she knew that she was different, she was living in that kind of world. So they thought what might help her would be to have another child that she could relate to. So they had another child, a little boy, and at first the boy seemed perfectly normal, and they thought it would kind of help her to normalize if she could have a child to relate to that was normal. So they were happy about the birth of this child. Then he started developing symptoms, and they thought at first he was autistic. The autism sometimes shows up in toddlerhood. Unfortunately, other illnesses show up at about the same time. So it turns out that they had to get separate apartments, the mother and the father, because they didn't want the girl, who clearly was schizophrenic, to hurt this little baby boy. So they were living, in a sense, had 2 separate residences to take care of it. Then when he started developing symptoms, at first he was judged to be autistic because he had some unusual things that cropped up during his toddlerhood, and this is sometimes where the symptoms do first show themselves. And then it was determined later on that he also had schizophrenia. So now they had 2 schizophrenic children instead of 1. And I was hoping that maybe they wouldn't have any more problems or any more children, because it would seem like there was something genetic involved in this, and it kept getting passed down to their children, whether on the mother's side or the father's side. I don't know as that was ever determined, but somewhere along the line there was a history of schizophrenia, and schizophrenia, although you don't inherit, they say you don't inherit mental illnesses, it is true that if a brain chemistry problem exists in the family, that brain problem in terms of the chemistry can kind of be passed down from generation to generation. There was somewhere, and I don't know where it was, so there was somewhere a genetic problem. Otherwise, the children would not be having schizophrenia. So, you know, it's very difficult to judge. So, severe retardation, the speech is limited or it's absent, one or the other. And you also have a lot of epilepsy, incontinence, self-injury in severely retarded children. The behavior is like that. And so that gets passed down. There's no cure and there's no medication for epilepsy that would work with these children. However, there is counseling that sometimes helps. There is special education that helps. A happy home life, which I imagine is hard to have when you have a severely disabled child, but a happy home life is also something that helps out with these children. The characteristics of severely retarded children are these. They cannot understand language. They cannot care for themselves. They may not be able to eat, drink, or do any of the usual functions without some kind of help. They may have to be fed. They may not be able to feed themselves. They cannot avoid danger. They'll walk right into traffic because they can't conceive of it. And I found out that when I was doing work with retarded children, and I worked in a school for retarded children for a year, and I really came to care for them a great deal, but they don't understand things that are of a, unless it's physical, they don't understand things of a spiritual nature or philosophic nature. You wouldn't be able to talk to them about right and wrong. You wouldn't be able to talk to them about democracy or concepts that we deal with every day that are no big problem. We can talk about democracy. We can talk about fairness. We can talk about how people should be treated. You know, all this kind of things that's not physical. The only thing they understand is something that's physical. Here's a table. That's a chair. You sit in the chair at the table to eat. You know, they understand things like that, and sometimes you even have to explain that. Here's a dishpan. This is how you wash a dish. This is a glass. But if you're going to talk about democracy or fairness or philosophical kinds of things, the differences between Republicans and Democrats or spiritual things, they just don't get it. They do not have a mind for it. They do need custodial care, because they can't take care of themselves. They can't predict what's going to happen. If they walk into traffic and there's a fast-moving truck, so there's a truck. There's me, I'm going to cross the street. They don't understand, look, that truck doesn't even see you. You're going to get hit. You're going to be hurt. They can't perceive anything like that. They only perceive what's present, what's now, what they can handle, what they can touch. If I brought some of them on a ride, I'd say, look at this beautiful scenery. They have no concept of that. You see that mountain, you see the sun on the mountain, isn't that pretty? Yeah, but they don't get it. They just really don't get it. So they're very limited in terms of what they can understand. The IQ of a 25, if the IQ is 25 or below, it's equivalent to being a 3-year-old in learning. So what does a 3-year-old know? Well, it depends upon the 3-year-old and how bright he is, but they're very limited. They don't know very much. They're just getting they're still in the toddler stage, really. They don't understand anything. They're talking a little bit, but they're not talking a lot. They can say hi, daddy, things like that. cat, ball, but they don't have much of an understanding. They're usually confined. Now, the characteristics of a moderately retarded person, they usually have to go to a special school to teach them, and I did some of that, and I found it very rewarding to teach children basics that we just take for granted because we see our mothers washing dishes, we know how to wash dishes, we just know. We just learn by observing. They're not going to learn by observing. It doesn't mean anything to them. So you have to teach them. Here's a table, here's a chair, here's where you sit down to eat, here's a dishpan, and these dishes have to be washed. You put a little soap in a pan, a dish pan. You don't put the whole bottle in, just a little bit, maybe a capful or so. You let the water run into the basin. You don't have it too hot. You don't have it too cold. You take your washcloth, your dishcloth, and you wash around. You get it clean. You rinse it off. You put it in the dryer, in the place where you're drying your dishes. And that stuff is just practical, everyday stuff that we do without even thinking. But they have to think what comes next. Let's see. I put the dish pan, fill it with warm to hot water. I put in a little dish liquid. I mix it up a little bit and get suds. I do this, I do that, and then the next step is to actually wash the dish, and then the next step is to actually rinse the dish, and then the next step is to put it in where I'm going to dry the dish. I might let it air dry. I may not even wipe the dish off, although we usually taught them to do that so they would understand the whole sequence, and that has to be taught. We had a special school where we taught math, and the whole school was based upon a gas station. The kids were car crazy. They loved cars. They wanted to grow up and drive a car. So what we did was take advantage of that. We had gas pumps, fake, of course, and we would say, what if a gallon of gas cost 25 cents? What does 2 gallons of gas cost? Well, it would be 25 plus 25, and you get the answer 50. And you have to be that simple in terms for them to grasp what it is that you're trying, and that you're trying to teach. And then if you're driving and you see this sign and you show them the stop sign, what do you do then? Well, you put your foot on the brake and you stop the car. Now, I think most of these children would never be able to drive. They'd never be able to take a car out in traffic. But their dream was, as youngsters, to be able to drive in traffic and have their own car. But we took advantage of that to teach them a certain amount of math. They have to have practical skills. When they walk down the street and they're walking on the sidewalk and there's a red light, they have to stop. They can't walk into the street. When the light is green and they have the right sign, they can go ahead and walk. And everything has to be of a practical nature so that when and if they ever are able to get out of the institution, they're able to live a life in which they're not completely confounded by things around them, and that they can do simple things on their own. They can take a walk, and they can stop when they're supposed to, and they can start when they're supposed to, and they don't walk in the middle of the street and get hit by a car. Practical things that will help them to live life. They're not going to understand anything about politics. They're not going to understand anything about what people discuss, what normal people discuss. They're not there. Their brains can't function like that. But they can be taught to do simple things, the things that will help them to live a comfortable life. But many of them will always have to have some supervision. So why teach them? It's going to be a lot easier for a person taking care of them if they know certain things and they don't have to have everything done for them. So they have to be able to learn how to do certain things. In as much as they're able to do, no one's going to expect them to be able to go to school and pass math classes. No one's going to be able to expect them to do that, but they have special schools to teach them how to live and to live comfortably so that they can maintain themselves to a certain degree and require less supervision, which makes it easier on the individuals taking care of them. I know some schools have an apartment where they teach. How do you make a bed? How do you take the laundry downstairs or wherever your machine is? How do you run a washing machine? Practical, everyday things that we just take for granted, but they can't take for granted because they're not going to pick it up by observation because their brains can't work in terms of I see this, so therefore I can copy it. Their brains aren't like that. Their brains are structured differently. Well, we're about out of time, so I'm going to close it here, but I'm going to continue with this next time. Please join me then.